A husky puppy was cruelly abandoned on a frozen lake, and his fight for survival moved the world. Between the icy waters and despair, the little warrior showed an impressive strength of will that forever changed the fate of everyone around him. A story of resilience, love, and miracles that will warm your heart on the coldest day. Get ready to be moved. Leave your like and comment where you're watching this incredible journey of overcoming. Can you imagine the despair of feeling the ice cracking under your paws while the freezing water invades your tiny body? The panic in those sapphire blue eyes reflected not just the fear of imminent death, but a painful question that echoed in every desperate yelp. Why would someone abandon him to die like this? An animal's heart is pure, knows no malice, holds no grudges, doesn't understand cruelty. And perhaps it was this purity that allowed the little husky puppy to find within himself a strength that even his creators couldn't have imagined existed. A strength that would transform not only his life, but that of an entire family and a community that would never be the same after that fateful day. The small town of Winter Haven looked like a postcard that December morning. The completely frozen lake reflected the crystal-clear blue sky, while freshly fallen snow covered the trees and rooftops with its white, immaculate mantle. For the locals, it was just another day in the long winter that turned the region into an icy kingdom for 6 consecutive months. For the 3-month-old husky puppy, it would be the day that decided whether there would be a tomorrow in his brief existence. The car engine rumbled, breaking the silence of the isolated landscape. Tire tracks drew parallel lines in the soft snow as the rear door opened for a brief moment. A struggling bundle was thrown onto the snow, and before he could even fully orient himself, the car had already sped away, leaving behind only a small ball of gray and white fur, with eyes the color of the winter sky. Disoriented, the puppy rose on his trembling paws. Instinct made him run towards the retreating vehicle, the only familiar reference in a world suddenly vast and terrifying. His thin, high-pitched yelps echoed, a plea not to be left alone that would never be answered by the one who had betrayed him. It was at that moment that the most terrifying sound he had ever heard in his short life echoed under his paws. The crack of thin ice breaking. In an instant, the solid ground disappeared, and his small body was swallowed by the black, icy water of the lake. At 15 degrees Fahrenheit, the water felt like thousands of needles simultaneously piercing his skin through his soft fur. The immediate thermal shock almost paralyzed his muscles, but something inside that tiny being refused to give up. With a survival instinct surprising for such a young puppy, he began to swim frantically, his little paws fighting against the freezing cold that threatened to turn every movement into unbearable torment. Not far away, in the cozy wooden cabin about 200 yards from the lake, the Sullivan family started their day with their usual routine. Martha, 68, was making pancakes while humming an old song from her youth. Thomas, her husband of nearly 5 decades, was flipping through the local newspaper by the crackling fireplace. Emily, their 16-year-old granddaughter spending winter break with her grandparents, was looking out the window distractedly, admiring the winter landscape. It was Emily who first noticed the small, dark spot struggling in the middle of the lake. At first, her eyes couldn't quite identify what that agitated patch was against the immaculate white. But when the reality of the situation finally hit her, a gasp escaped her lips. "Grandpa, there's something in the lake. I think it's a dog. It's drowning." Thomas dropped the newspaper instantly. In his 72 years of life, many of them dedicated to volunteer rescue in the local mountains, he had developed a sense of urgency that time hadn't erased. Without hesitation, he grabbed his heaviest coat and a thick rope he kept in the emergency closet. "Martha, call Animal Rescue. Emily, get some warm blankets and towels ready. I'll be back in a few minutes." Meanwhile, on the lake, the little husky fought desperately against exhaustion. Each movement became harder than the last. The freezing water quickly drained the heat from his tiny body, and his muscles began to fail. With impressive intelligence, he swam in circles, trying to break the thin ice around him to create a surface where he could support himself. His claws scratched at the icy edge, but the ice kept breaking under his weight. With each failed attempt, a small whimper escaped his throat. It wasn't just pain or fear. It was a call, a plea for help that seemed destined to remain unanswered in the white vastness of that icy morning. Thomas immediately realized the ice wouldn't support his weight. Cursing under his breath, he ran back to the shed attached to the cabin. Inside, an old wooden canoe rested, almost forgotten among tools and fishing gear. With a strength that defied his age, he dragged the boat to the lake's edge. Lying down on the canoe, he began to carefully pull himself across the ice. The fragile surface cracked menacingly under the combined weight of the man and the boat, but the weight distribution allowed for slow, steady progress. Each yard felt like an eternity to Thomas, whose eyes didn't leave the small animal now moving slower and slower in the dark water. "Hang on, little guy, I'm coming," Thomas shouted, as if his words could give strength to the exhausted puppy. The warmth of the cabin, Martha had hung up the phone with a somber expression. "Animal rescue can't get through. The roads are blocked by last night's blizzard." Emily felt tears sting her eyes. Is Grandpa going to be able to save the puppy? Martha hugged her granddaughter, her own eyes welling up. "Your grandfather has saved many lives in these mountains, dear. If anyone can do it, it's him." On the lake, a silent battle against time unfolded. The husky puppy, driven by a will to live that defied his fragile condition, kept fighting. His movements, once frantic, were now slow and calculated. Hypothermia was beginning to affect his brain, inducing a lethargy that, paradoxically, could condemn him or save him. The slightest unnecessary movement meant wasted energy he no longer had to spare. Thomas was now only a few yards from the hole in the ice. He could clearly see the puppy, his paws weakly hitting against the frozen edge. It was at that moment that he witnessed something he would never forget. The little husky, gathering strength that seemed impossible for his body almost paralyzed by the cold, managed to dig his claws into the ice and, in a movement that defied all logic, partially hoisted his body out of the water. For a brief instant, his blue eyes met Thomas's, and the man swore he saw in them not just fear, but a fierce determination to survive. Stretching out the coat he had brought, Thomas offered it to the puppy. As if understanding exactly what he needed to do, the little animal bit the fabric with the little strength he had left, allowing himself to be pulled to the relative safety of the canoe. "That's it, brave boy. Hold on tight." Thomas quickly wrapped the wet coat around the puppy's trembling body, which now looked like a small, pathetic bundle of soaked fur. His blue eyes, however, remained open, fixed on the face of the man who had saved him, as if wanting to memorize every detail of that face. The return to shore was as slow and careful as the journey out. Every movement was calculated, every shift measured to avoid breaking the treacherous ice. Thomas felt the puppy tremble violently against his chest, a tremor that revealed both the fight against the cold and the spark of life that refused to be extinguished. When he finally reached the shore, Thomas was met by Martha and Emily, who ran to him with blankets warmed by the fireplace. "Is he alive?" Emily's voice trembled as much as the small being wrapped in the soaked coat. "He's fighting to stay," Thomas replied, as he carefully transferred the puppy to the warm blankets. "And by the determination I saw out there, he's a true warrior." Martha, who had worked as a nurse for 40 years before retiring, immediately took charge of the situation. With quick, precise movements, she began drying the puppy's fur, using towels that had been warmed beforehand. "We need to raise his body temperature gradually. Emily, bring more warm towels. Thomas, prepare some warm milk with sugar. We'll need to give him energy as soon as he can swallow." While they worked to save the puppy's life, they discovered he had no collar or microchip. There was nothing to indicate who he belonged to or where he came from. Just a small, malnourished body and some scars on his paws that silently told a story of neglect. The following hours were critical. The puppy's temperature remained dangerously low, and his tiny body struggled to recover from the severe trauma. Martha used all her medical knowledge, applying gradual rewarming techniques and constantly monitoring the little patient's vital signs. It was Emily who suggested the name. "Let's call him Miracle, because that's what happened today. A true miracle." Thomas and Martha exchanged a look filled with emotion. The name couldn't have been more appropriate. Throughout the night, The elderly couple took turns by the puppy's side. Every hour, Martha checked his temperature and offered small amounts of warm milk, which Miracle accepted with increasing difficulty. His small body fought against hypothermia, and each breath seemed like a battle. In the early morning, when the living room clock struck 3, a decisive moment occurred. Thomas, who was on watch, noticed that the puppy's constant trembling had stopped. For a terrifying instant, he thought the worst had happened. But as he approached, he saw that Miracle was breathing more regularly, his small body now relaxed in a deep but stable sleep. "Martha," he called softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I think he's going to make it." The next morning, Miracle opened his blue eyes to a completely new world. A world where there was warmth, safety, and people who cared. With a caution that spoke volumes about his previous experiences, he accepted the food offered by Emily and allowed himself to be petted briefly, a concession that brought tears to the teenager's eyes. The following days revealed more about the personality of the little survivor. Miracle demonstrated exceptional intelligence, quickly learning the house routine and responding to basic commands with surprising ease. But two traits stood out above all: an unwavering loyalty to his saviors, following them around the house like a small, furry shadow, and a deep, visceral fear of water. Even the water in his bowl caused a slight tremor in his body when he approached it. A week after the rescue, Thomas finally managed to contact the veterinarian in the neighboring town. Dr. Peterson, a middle-aged man who had cared for the animals in the region for decades, examined Miracle with paternal care. "It's a real miracle he survived," he confirmed, unconsciously echoing the name chosen for the puppy. Siberian Huskies are naturally resistant to cold, but a puppy so young, malnourished, and abandoned, the odds were minimal. The full examination revealed more than they expected. Besides malnutrition and small scars, Miracle showed signs of prolonged neglect. His fur was dull in some areas, indicating previous nutritional problems before the abandonment. A small scar near his right ear suggested an untreated injury. Someone deliberately mistreated him, the vet concluded, anger barely contained in his usually calm voice. "You saved more than his life. You saved his chance to know what it's truly like to be loved." Martha and Thomas exchanged a silent look. It didn't need to be said aloud. Miracle had found his permanent home. The next 2 weeks were dedicated to the puppy's full recovery. Under the attentive care of the Sullivan family, Miracle gained weight and vitality every day. His fur acquired a stunning silver sheen, and his blue eyes now sparkled with curiosity and joy, instead of the terror they had witnessed on the lake. But it was in the 3rd week that Miracle demonstrated his worth, went far beyond the adorable companionship he provided. Emily, who had suffered from asthma since childhood, had a severe attack during the night. Her emergency inhaler was empty, and the replacement medication was downstairs in the cabin. It was Miracle who noticed first. At only 6 months old, the puppy detected the change in Emily's breathing before she even fully woke up. With surprising determination, he began barking insistently at the door of her grandparents' bedroom. Thomas, initially annoyed by the unusual noise, changed his expression to concern upon seeing the agitation of the normally calm puppy. Following Miracle, who ran back to Emily's room, he found his granddaughter in clear respiratory distress. That night, as Emily slept peacefully after receiving the necessary medication, Thomas and Martha contemplated the little dog sleeping, curled up next to their granddaughter's bed, like a small, furry guardian. "How did he know?" Martha asked in a low voice, emotion making it tremble. "How could a puppy so young understand?" Thomas shook his head, equally amazed. "Maybe some souls just recognize when they need to save each other." Winter Haven's harsh winter gradually gave way to the first signs of spring. The lake began to thaw at the edges, and small purple and yellow flowers bravely emerged through the melting snow. To everyone's surprise, it turned out that Miracle loved these flowers, spending hours sniffing them with an almost human delight. It was during one of these spring walks that Thomas brought the local newspaper home, with a news report that would clarify part of the mystery about Miracle's origin. A police investigation had discovered an illegal dog breeding operation in the area. The owner, a woman named Eleanor Blackwood, sold purebred puppies online without a license and kept the animals in deplorable conditions. "We need to inform the authorities," Martha decided after reading the report. If Miracle came from that place, his testimony could help save other dogs. The visit from the animal protection officer, Ryan Cooper, confirmed their suspicions. The photographs of Miracle and the records of his scars and physical condition at the time of the rescue matched the pattern of other animals rescued from the clandestine kennel. "You didn't just save his life," the officer explained. "You're helping build a solid case against a person who caused suffering to dozens of innocent animals." Spring also brought the traditional Thaw Festival, a celebration marking the town's rebirth after the long winter. Among the many activities, there was an informal dog agility competition, where locals proudly displayed their dog's skills. Emily, who had spent hours training Miracle using techniques she researched online, insisted on entering him. At 5 months old, he was now a vigorous puppy, with a strong, athletic body that completely belied the fragile state he had been found in. "Are you sure, dear?" Martha asked, worried. "He's still very young, and most of the other dogs have been training for years." Emily's determined look reminded her of her grandfather's. "Miracle isn't like most dogs, Grandma. He has something special inside him." On the day of the competition, a small crowd gathered in Winter Haven's Central Park. The obstacle course wasn't professional, but it represented a considerable challenge. Tunnels, hurdles to jump, slalom between poles, and an elevated ramp. Most participants were adult dogs of breeds traditionally associated with agility: Border Collies, Australian Shepherds, and some particularly agile terriers. When it was Miracle's turn, a murmur of surprise went through the audience. A Siberian Husky Puppy, a breed known for its independence and occasional stubbornness, seemed an unusual choice for such a competition. Some condescending smiles were exchanged among the other competitors. Emily knelt down to meet Miracle's eyes. "Remember, no matter what happens, you're already a champion to me," she whispered, stroking the puppy's soft ears. What happened next became part of Winter Haven's local folklore. Miracle navigated the course with a combination of precision, speed, and joy that left spectators speechless. Each obstacle was tackled with a fierce determination that contrasted with the animal's youth. In the tunnels, which many dogs feared, for their darkness, Miracle slid through like a silver arrow. In the slalom, his movements were fluid and graceful like a choreographed dance. But it was on the elevated ramp that Miracle truly shone. While other dogs hesitated before the height, he climbed without the slightest hesitation, stopping at the highest point with a proud posture that drew spontaneous applause from the crowd. For a moment, it seemed to everyone present that the little rejected puppy had found his moment of glory, proving his worth to the community that now embraced him. When the judge announced that Miracle had taken second place, losing only to a professional competition Border Collie, the Sullivan family couldn't hold back tears of pride. For them, it wasn't just a victory in a local competition. It was a celebration of the extraordinary journey of a small being who had been discarded as worthless and now shone like a true treasure. Summer arrived with its gentle warmth, transforming Winter Haven into a paradise of lush greens and colorful flowers. Miracle, now 6 months old, had grown into a lean, strong young dog whose blue eyes retained that unique mix of sweetness and determination that had captivated everyone around him. It was on a particularly warm afternoon that the cabin phone rang. Martha answered, surprised to hear the agitated voice of Diane Lewis, director of the animal shelter in the neighboring town. "Martha, you need to come to the shelter immediately." Her voice conveyed unusual urgency. "We found something, someone. You need to see." Intrigued, Thomas, Martha, and Emily drove to the shelter, taking Miracle in the back seat. The puppy, who usually got restless on car rides, remained strangely calm, as if sensing that something important was about to happen. At the shelter, Diane quickly led them down a hallway to an isolated kennel at the back of the building. She arrived last night, part of a rescue from the same clandestine operation. As soon as I saw the photos of Miracle in the local paper, I noticed the incredible resemblance. Inside the kennel, an adult female Siberian husky rested on a padded cushion. Her silver fur had the same distinctive pattern as Miracle's, and her eyes, a deep, crystal-clear blue, were like mirrors of the puppy's eyes. Despite her thinness and visible signs of neglect, her beauty was striking. "We believe this is Aurora, Miracle's biological mother," Diane explained. "Records seized from the breeding operation confirm she gave birth to a litter of 4 puppies approximately 6 months ago. 3 were sold online. The 4th was discarded in the lake," Thomas finished, his voice heavy with contained emotion. The moment that followed was forever etched in the memory of everyone present. When Emily carefully brought Miracle closer to the kennel, allowing him to see the adult husky, a silence charged with anticipation filled the air. For long seconds, mother and son looked at each other through the kennel bars. Then, Aurora emitted a soft sound. Not a bark, but a low, melodious moan that seemed to carry all the complex emotions of a mother reuniting with her lost child. Miracle responded with a sharp yelp, his tail wagging so quickly it was a silver blur. When the kennel door was opened, there was no hesitation. Aurora stood up, still weak from her ordeal, and walked directly to Miracle. With infinite gentleness, she began to lick the puppy's face, while he squirmed with joy under her care. The recognition was undeniable, transcending any rational explanation, a bond that not even months of separation and suffering had managed to break. No discussion was needed. The decision to adopt Aurora was unanimous and instantaneous. But with that decision came a practical challenge. The Sullivans' small cabin, cozy and perfect for an elderly couple, and occasionally their granddaughter, would hardly accommodate 2 large dogs when Aurora and Miracle reached their adult size. News of the reunion between mother and son spread quickly through the Winter Haven community. In a display of solidarity that characterized small northern towns, neighbors organized a work party to build an extension onto the Sullivans' cabin, including a space specifically dedicated to the 2 huskies. For 3 consecutive weekends, the sound of hammers and saws replaced the usual silence around the cabin. Men and women of all ages worked side by side, transforming donated materials into a new cozy room and a fenced outdoor area where the dogs could run freely. Aurora recovered physically every day under the care of the Sullivan family. Her fur regained its healthy sheen, and her thinness gave way to an athletic, strong form. More impressive, however, was her emotional recovery. The dog, who initially flinched at the slightest sudden movement, gradually began to trust again, mirroring her son's relationship with the human family. The relationship between Aurora and Miracle fascinated everyone who witnessed it. The mother resumed her role with moving naturalness, teaching the puppy canine behaviors he hadn't properly learned during his early development. She gently corrected him when necessary, and showed obvious pride when he displayed his newly acquired skills. With the arrival of autumn, marking almost a year since Miracle's rescue, a new challenge arose. The puppy, now nearly an adult, continued to show a deep terror of any body of water larger than his drinking bowl. The simple sight of the bathroom with the bathtub full was enough to make him tremble uncontrollably and hide under the furniture. Emily, determined to help Miracle overcome his trauma, researched behavioral therapy for dogs extensively. With guidance from Dr. Peterson, she developed a gradual program to desensitize the husky to his greatest fear. They started with simple steps, bringing him near tiny puddles, generously rewarding him for every small step of progress. Gradually, they increased the challenge to shallow streams and finally to the lake's edge, though always staying away from the specific spot where the abandonment had occurred. Progress was slow and non-linear. There were days of encouraging breakthroughs followed by frustrating setbacks, but Emily's infinite patience and Aurora's constant support, demonstrating to the puppy how to approach the water without fear, gradually yielded results. It was on the exact anniversary of his rescue, a year after that fateful morning, that the Sullivan family decided to take Miracle back to the lake, now thawed under the autumn sun. Not as a cruel ordeal, but as an opportunity to close a cycle, to prove to the dog, and perhaps to themselves, that fears can be faced and overcome. When they reached the shore, Miracle immediately tensed up. His whole body trembled visibly, and for a moment, Emily questioned the wisdom of that decision. Were they asking too much? Would it be insensitive to expose the animal to the sight of his deepest trauma? Aurora, however, seemed to intuitively understand the purpose of that moment. With maternal gentleness, she positioned herself beside her son, her body conveying calm and security. Slowly, she walked to the water's edge, looking back occasionally as if inviting Miracle to follow her. For long minutes, the young husky remained, frozen, his internal conflict visible in every tense muscle. The family stood in respectful silence, allowing him to process his emotions at his own pace. Then, in a movement that brought tears to the eyes of everyone present, Miracle took a hesitant step towards the water. Then another, and another, until, finally, with a courage that seemed a physical contradiction to the tremor still running through his body, he stretched out his paw and touched the surface of the lake. The water rippled gently under his touch, creating small concentric circles that expanded across the tranquil surface. To any casual observer, it would just be a dog touching water. To those who knew his story, it was an act of transcendental courage, a symbol that even the deepest traumas are not irreversible when surrounded by love and patience. That simple touch of the water was just the beginning of a new phase in Miracle's journey. In the following weeks, with constant encouragement from Aurora and Emily, he gradually overcame his fear. First, wetting his paws at the edge. Then, wading knee-deep in the shallow parts. Finally, to the astonished joy of the Sullivan family, swimming briefly in the lake on a particularly warm, late autumn day. The story of Miracle's extraordinary recovery did not go unnoticed in the community. The local newspaper published an article about his journey, detailing not only the dramatic rescue, but also his impressive resilience and the miraculous reunion with his mother. The report concluded with a moving interview with Thomas Sullivan, who described how a small being discarded as worthless had transformed his family's life and united an entire community around values of compassion and protection. The impact of this story transcended Winter Haven's borders. Inspired by Miracle's journey, the town council approved a series of new animal welfare laws, including harsher penalties for abandonment and a fund dedicated to the rescue and rehabilitation of at-risk animals. The Miracle Fund, as it was affectionately named, would be maintained by voluntary community donations and intended to cover emergency veterinary expenses for families who couldn't afford the costs. When the second winter arrived in Winter Haven, bringing with it the return of intense cold and the frozen lake, Miracle was unrecognizable compared to the frightened, near-death puppy of the previous year. Now a young adult with luxurious fur and an elegant build, he displayed a confidence and joy for life that inspired everyone around him. On a particularly cold December morning, the Sullivan family and their two huskies were taking their morning walk around the lake, now completely frozen again. Suddenly, desperate screams broke the tranquility of the winter landscape. A neighborhood child, little 7-year-old Noah, had ventured onto the thin ice and was now trapped about 20 yards from shore, unable to return or move forward without breaking the fragile surface under his feet. Thomas quickly assessed the situation with his experienced eyes. The ice wouldn't support an adult's weight, and the canoe he had used in Miracle's rescue was stored far away, in the cabin's shed. The minutes needed to retrieve it could be fatal. It was at that moment that Miracle did something extraordinary. Before anyone could react, he deliberately stepped onto the ice, his body distributing his weight to minimize pressure at any single point. With slow, calculated steps, he gradually approached the terrified boy. "He's going to fall too," Martha exclaimed, terrified. But Thomas watched with a different understanding in his eyes. "No, he knows exactly what he's doing. Look at his posture. He's distributing his weight perfectly on the ice." When Miracle reached Noah, he positioned himself beside the boy, offering his collar as a point of support. With a wisdom that seemed impossible for such a young animal, he slowly began to guide the boy back to safety, step by step, carefully choosing the safest path across the fragile ice. From the shore, The Sullivan family watched, holding their breath as the dog, who a year earlier had been a victim of the same treacherous lake, now became the savior of another innocent life. When they finally reached the safety of the shore, Noah threw himself into his mother's arms, who was crying with relief. Miracle, in turn, received an emotional hug from Emily, who buried her face in the soft fur of the dog's neck, her tears of pride wetting his shiny coat. "How did he know what to do?" Noah asked later, wrapped in warm blankets in the Sullivans' living room, drinking hot chocolate while waiting for his parents to return from the neighboring town. "How wasn't he afraid of the ice?" Thomas exchanged a meaningful look with Martha before answering. "Maybe because he understands, better than many of us, that our greatest fears can turn into our greatest strengths, and that sometimes we need to face what we fear most to discover what we're truly capable of." That night, as the family gathered around the crackling fireplace, Aurora and Miracle slept curled up next to each other on the soft rug. The golden light of the flames reflected on their silver fur, creating an almost magical aura around the two dogs who had found their way back to each other against all odds. Thomas quietly contemplated the scene, a deep sense of gratitude filling his heart. Who could have imagined that this small being abandoned to die in a frozen lake would be the catalyst for so many transformations? A family that rediscovered its purpose, a community that united around values of compassion and protection, and now, a young life saved by the courage of a dog who had experienced the same danger firsthand. There was something deeply poetic in that symmetry, Thomas thought, as if the universe had conspired to turn a tragedy into a cycle of redemption that continued to expand, touching more and more lives. Martha, noticing his thoughtful gaze, gently squeezed his hand. "What are you thinking about, dear?" Thomas smiled, his eyes still fixed on the two sleeping huskies. "I'm thinking about how we called the puppy Miracle when we found him. But maybe the real miracle wasn't him surviving that day." "And what was it then?" asked Emily, who was listening to the conversation. "The real miracle," Thomas replied, his voice filled with emotion, "is how a small being who experienced the worst of humanity was still able to show us the best of it. How someone who had every reason to fear and hate still chose to trust and love. And how that choice, made day after day by a heart that could easily have hardened, ended up saving much more than one life. It saved our humanity." Outside, the snow began to fall again, over Winter Haven, covering the landscape with a new immaculate white blanket. Inside the cozy cabin, the fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. And at the center of it all, two dogs who had found their home and a family who had found a purpose slept peacefully, their hearts beating in a synchronized rhythm that spoke of bonds deeper than blood and stronger than suffering. Miracle's journey, from abandonment to redemption, from despair to hope, from fear to courage, would continue to inspire everyone who knew it. A living testament that even in the darkest circumstances, even when all odds seem impossible, there is always the possibility of a miracle. Not necessarily a miracle of divine intervention or extraordinary coincidence, but the kind of miracle that happens every day when hearts open, hands reach out, and the circle of compassion expands to include even the most vulnerable and forgotten among us. And perhaps, Thomas reflected as his own eyes grew heavy with approaching sleep, that is the greatest miracle of all, the capacity of love to transform, not just one life, but all the lives it touches, creating ripples of kindness that continue to spread long after the initial act of compassion has been forgotten. Outside the cabin, the snow continued to fall silently, covering the day's footprints. Inside, the warmth of the fireplace and shared love kept the cold at bay, a constant reminder that even in life's harshest winters, there is always the promise of spring, and the certainty that no heart is too small to perform miracles.